part of my job requires me to show up authentically as who I am and share my story, because LGBTQ people have very unique life experiences, and not a lot of people know how to serve our community.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Pod Vlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story, and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path, and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Activation warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of suicide, self-harm, sexual assault, and rape. Discretionary caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode and seek immediate help through the National Suicide Hotline by dialing 988 if you are emotionally activated or triggered by the content of this episode. Or, if you're activated and need help from the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 49, and it is part one of a two-part series featuring my special guest, Bailie. Bailie is the Director of Training and Technical Assistance in the Napa County office of the LGBTQ Connection. There is so much good to say about Bailie. It's not possible to tell you all I want to tell in this short episode introduction, but I do want you to know that even though Bailie and I have never met in person, and even though I've only known her for just shy of a month, Bailie is already a dear, close friend. We immediately connected on a heart level during our first phone call. It's an honor to call Bailie a friend. Bailie bared her heart and soul in this extremely powerful episode, so I want to publicly dedicate this episode to anyone and everyone who has lost a loved one, friend, or colleague to suicide. This is Suicide Prevention Month. Please help raise awareness by sharing resources that help others recognize the warning signs for suicide and know how to get help. The 24-hour National Suicide Hotline is available by dialing 988. It is important to know that there is a connection between sexual assault, rape, and suicide. Please do your part to help prevent sexual assault and rape suicide. One of the best ways to do this is to start by believing. Another way is to pay particular attention to this episode. Here's Bailie. Welcome, Bailie, to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I am so honored that you're here and excited to have a conversation with you just based on the phone calls we've had already. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Dave. I'm really excited to be here and to finally talk to you and just seeing where this conversation goes today. I'm a fan of your work and of the podcast, and also just really excited to be able to have this opportunity to speak my truth and share my story.
Well, thank you. It's nice of you to say that. It does my heart good. So thank you for those kind words. I'm going to let you, if you don't mind, tell the audience how it is that we connected.
Well, I had come across your podcast a while back. I'm less than a year into a really intensive healing journey from disclosing my sexual assault to my parents just last year. I'm a 43-year-old woman, so a lifetime of holding secrets, which I'm hoping that we can talk about today. But I've been trying to connect with other survivors and just try to lean more into the storytelling as we're hearing other people's stories. I met Caroline Markel Hammond, who is I believe that she's the CEO of Safe and Harm's Way. I don't know her official title. Yep. Okay. And I was doing an outreach event for the organization that I currently work for, LGBTQ Connection here in Napa, and it was a pride event, and we were just promoting some events, and she happened to just come up and sparked a conversation. I didn't know who she was or what her field was at the time, so I had started kind of talking about my background, which is in victim services, and I was actually going to be going back that week to lead a presentation to the staff I used to work with on the intersection of being LGBTQ and a survivor. And she was like, wait, I run this organization that is really cool, we need to talk. And so we just connected that way, exchanged phone numbers. We've actually yet to have a conversation in person. Hi, Caroline. I know I owe you a conversation, a phone call, but we had always had plans to kind of meet up. So I had been following your podcast, and then I had saw very recently that she was a guest on it again. And I was like, wait, hold up. And so that's when I reached out to you, and I was like, hi, I am this person going through this journey. I'm also a survivor. I feel like I have an interesting story to tell and that I would like to share. And I know, Caroline, would you be interested? And that's when me and you just kind of started texting. And then we had a very lovely first conversation. And we had another very lovely second conversation. And here we are today. So thank you.
I am just thrilled, honored, and privileged to have you. It's so cool that we have that mutual connection with Caroline, and the fact that you had heard her on this podcast and then reached out to me is just amazing to me. And I commend you for your courage and your strength, especially the tiny little bit that you've told me that you've been through. And in fact, that's why we're here. You have this opportunity to talk about your experience, and you said you're ready. And that means the world to me, because I am a strong believer in telling our story is one of the first steps to the healing journey. And you said that it hasn't been too long that you've been on this healing journey. So I'm really excited that you've chosen Sexual Assault Survivor Stories to tell your story. If you are ready, what are you able to tell us about your experience?
Well, I think today I want to go back to, I noticed right behind you is a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. Am I right? On the shelf there. Well, let's go to the bridge. September 10th, which would be today, 10 years ago, 2013, 8:04 p.m. I snapped a picture, and I actually still have the picture of the lights below the South Tower. I was going to end my life that evening. I don't know what it was that day that had kind of triggered me. I was working in the restaurant industry at the time and working a lot in San Francisco. Something that day really just made me decide that it was the day. But I had been doing a dance with the bridge for many months leading up to that. And what got me to the bridge is definitely related to my sexual assault. But I had an encounter with the person who had harmed me 2 years prior. My grandmother, who was a very, very, very important person in my life, was really sick. I knew something was wrong, and I had moved away from Southern California many years ago, so I hadn't been home for very long, and made a trip home and found my grandmother to be really sick, and that, she wound up going into the hospital, having surgery, almost dying, and all that kind of stuff. At the time, this was 2010-ish, I was still using alcohol. I was still smoking a lot of weed, using those mechanisms to kind of cope with all the craziness in my life at the time. I remember going to a grocery store near my parents' house, and I was walking down the liquor aisle, just to go check out, and I saw the person who harmed me. And I recognized them by a tattoo on a part of their body. I don't want to say this person's name, and I don't really want to give too much identifying information, but the person had come in and out of my life for many years. And the last time I had saw them, I was actually in high school, and they had acquired a tattoo. So it was really easy for me to recognize that this was that person. And I didn't really put two and two together, but my body reacted to it. It was this is, wow, okay. And I wound up going home to my parents' house, not thinking anything of it. My grandma winds up getting to a place where she's stable. I go back home which was in Napa at the time, but still living in Napa. That's when I started to have the memories, the flashbacks, all the stuff just kind of came back. And I hadn't admitted to myself what happened to me. I kind of kept what happened to me a secret. And it was many, many years before I even admitted to myself that I was a child sexual abuse survivor, that I had been harmed. Yeah, I didn't talk to anybody about it. I came back to Napa and basically just struggled by myself. I was with someone at the time who it's sad to say that I was with my partner that I didn't really trust, to be honest with, and tell them what was really going on with me, which led to its own slew of problems and stuff. And so I became severely depressed, really withdrawn. It started to really affect me at work. I remember my business partner at the time kind of pulling me aside and just being like, yo, like, what is up with you? I wasn't even able to communicate what was going on. That's where my obsession and fascination with the bridge came in. I have always been a person that's struggled with suicide ideology. It's funny, I actually have this artifact here. This is a picture of me. It's a cool picture when I was a little girl at 4 years old. And on the back of it, though, is a picture that I drew of myself cutting my own head off. And I remember drawing this picture. Like, I have a memory of me in my bedroom drawing this picture. And so self-harm for me was something that started like really, really early on. Get to what happened to me, eventually, but the self-harm part was something that was kind of just always there. And it's still there, even though I've gone through therapy and I've worked through this stuff, and I don't have, it's been 10 years since I have had any attempts to take my own life. It's still something I think about all the time. It's always an out for me. When things get really, really, really bad in my life, I go there, and it's just an option. And it's something I have to work with every single day. And I have conversations with myself all the time. And it's like I've made friends with that part of myself now, this really deep, dark part of me that tells me that when things get really bad, I can just throw myself off the bridge or throw myself into a bus, or I can blow my brains out, or I can try to hang myself, or I can overdose. And I'm saying those because those are all things that I've done in my past to harm myself, leading up to 10 years ago. Yeah, that night, I remember being on the bridge, and the wind is really, 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 really bad sometimes in the city with the fog rolling through. And it was one of those really thick nights where it was just like foggy, and you could feel, I could feel the stinging of the water pellets, like stinging my cheeks and stinging the back of my neck. And I can still close my eyes right now and look down, and I can see that light and the orange railing being really slippery and wet. And so I had taken the picture. I put my phone into my backpack, and I tied my backpack to the railing, and that was it. And I stood there for a while, and I remember a couple times kind of pulling myself over, and it was this vacillation of I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And then fear. What am I doing? I can't do this. I need to do this. I can't do this. I need to do this. I can't do this. And it was this just kind of this struggle. And it was in that struggle that call it the voice of God or the voice of reason or the voice of whatever, but that voice of hey, what the hell are you doing? You need to call somebody. And that's what I did. So I called someone, I'm not going to say who they are, called this person and told them where I was. And they were very well, we have 3 options here, Bailie. You can jump, which is going to be really, really sad. And I'm going to miss you, and your family's going to miss you. And it's going to devastate a lot of people. And a bright light from the world is going to go away. I can call and I'm 5150 you. You're going to be arrested, and you're going to spend however many hours in some county place in San Francisco. And you're going to want to kill yourself after that experience. Or you can stay on the phone with me and talk to me, get in your car and drive back to Napa, and we can see where we go from there. And that's ultimately what I decided to do. And I remember in the moment of talking to this person and telling them, I came to realize really, really, really deeply that I didn't want to die, that I wanted a part of myself to die. I needed that part of myself to die. And that was when I finally told this person what was going on with me, what I was struggling with. And then that person helped me get to some therapy where I continued to really kind of disclose what had happened. So that was the first time I had actually physically told another person. This happened to me when I was in 4th grade, and it kept happening to me as I grew up through middle school. And then some things happened when I was in high school. That was a big step for me. And I wasn't ever planning on going public. I wasn't ever going and talking to Dave Markel and his podcast about what happened. But my life kind of led me into jobs and careers and spaces where sharing my story became really important to the work that I was doing. And it continues to be to this day. Yeah. So that was partly why I wanted to talk to you, was the significance of today too, because it's a big day for me. I didn't really think anything of it. And then every year this time I would get really emotional or sentimental, or I'd get depressed, right? All these kind of things would come up, or this, I'd be upset at myself about not being honest, or all those years that I beat myself up for all these things. And that cycle that we go through. And so every year for the past 5 years, it's been more of this is an important thing to celebrate. And this is an important thing to talk about, because nobody talks about this. I remember the first time I actually posted this publicly was 5 years ago. And I know that because a memory actually came up on my Facebook this morning from 5 years ago. And I'm a creative person. I'm a writer. I have literally in my office right now, I'm surrounded by journals that I've been documenting my life and my experiences and all of these things, which maybe one day it'll turn into something beautiful. I don't know. But I have all of this stuff. And now I'm like ready to be at peace with the stuff and do something with it. And so that's it. I feel like you might want to respond. So I'll let you.
Well, I have so many responses. I guess, first of all, the empathic side of me says, I am so sorry for the experience that you had that took you to that place, that is still residing inside of you, that says there's a part of you that wants to die. But at the same time, I'm excited for you and thrilled that you have gotten to the point where you can talk about it, because it, like sexual assault, is so taboo that people don't talk about it for fear of a million things. I think part of it is the fear that the feelings that are evoked and come up in that person's life, but also the fears of, if I say this, maybe it will fall on someone's ears in the wrong way and cause someone to do something I hope they don't do, which is kill themselves. But it could also be helpful. And I think that's the aspect of it I want to dwell on. And I think obviously you want to dwell on, or you wouldn't be wanting to tell your story. And then the other aspect of this, and I kind of get the impression that you were going to go there, and that is this feeling of wanting to kill part of you started before your fourth grade. So it was there before the sexual assault. Yeah. And I'm really curious as to what you're thinking the origins of that are.
Yeah, I think it's before me. I mean, I think this is also generational things that have been played out. And I say that because, and I can't share anybody's story other than my own, but I can say that I am probably, from my understanding of my family's past and my family's history, I'm most likely fourth generation sexual violence survivor in my family. And I know that very close relatives of mine, women in my life, have been affected by sexual violence, and it has therefore affected their life. It's in my blood. I don't know how else to say it. It is in my blood. I feel that some of the stuff that I even struggle with comes from that. It's before me. I don't want to say this and be like, oh my gosh, Bailie had such a hard, life, or her parents weren't there, or this or that, because that's like not what I'm saying. It's not any of those things. I had a lot of that. Like, I had a very supportive, loving family who did their best with what they had. And with how evolved they are, or with the support that they got growing up from their families. And, that's where this kind of generational stuff comes in. If you have families that maybe don't talk about things and sweep things under the rug, and that just becomes like the culture of the family. That might be my unit, but also the extended units too in the family as well. Those kinds of things are carried on. I feel like it very much was like that in our home. We had it was very fun. It was very open. There was a lot of laughter. There was a lot of other things as well in terms of, fighting and whatnot, because it's like we're, typical family, whatever, but that has this kind of unspoken history of things that have happened. And that manifests itself in behaviors or whatever in the people that you are around. And also getting help and going to therapy wasn't really something that was anything my parents were really brought up to believe that was worthwhile or useful. And therefore I wasn't really reared in that either. And the going to therapy or talking to somebody about issues wasn't things that you did. And so I never really had that kind of modeled for me, that we talk openly about these problems, that we share things that happen to us. It was the opposite. I always felt like if I were honest about the things that happened to me, well, one, I was threatened, so then I would be harmed, or my sister would have been harmed. That stuff was very much, even though like it was a little kid that was threatening me, but whatever. I feel like now I should just kind of get into like what happened to me, because so I was assaulted the first time. And I have to say like assaulted because it's kind of, even this memory is really foggy, but in exploring the big assault that happened to me, through therapy, I actually uncovered that there was an incident before even that one. And I don't even know what age I was, but I have very vivid memories of being in my own backyard with the neighbor that had shared the fence behind us, who was an older woman, and being forced to suck on breasts and touch body parts and things like that. That was like my first real violation. And I think back on it, it doesn't feel like a violation, but it definitely was. Like, little girls shouldn't be doing that with older girls. And then what happened later was, so me and my sister were two girls out of, I think it was like 8 boys in the neighborhood. And my goal as a little kid was to be better than all the boys. I was going to ride my bike faster, climb the tree higher. I was going to hit harder. And I did. I was all of those things. I was really athletic. I love sports. Sports was a really good outlet for me and became really important to me later on. I loved the Army. I was all camouflage, didn't want to brush my hair. I wore hats. I just wanted to play Army. I wanted to be in the Army. There was a neighbor boy down the street who was older one afternoon. We used to play Army. We used to play shed, all that kind of stuff in his shed. One afternoon, it was him and another student from our class who didn't live like on our street, but lived a few streets over. And we wound up in his backyard. He had this rusty like switchblade thing from his grandfather. And it was like we were just kind of playing, and that play turned into me being pinned on the ground with one of the girl holding me by my neck, choking me with a knife, and the other boy ripping my pants off, shoving various things inside of me. And it being like, it started out as a game, and then it turned very much not into a game, and it turned very much into a, like, we're going to hurt you kind of a thing.
I'm so sorry that happened. I'm impressed, though, that you can even get the words out. These are things that most people cannot even discuss and talk about and recollect in a verbal way. Thank you for saying what you're saying, but at the same time, I want to check in with you and make sure that you're okay.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm okay.
Okay.
The recollection part, as a survivor and people that go through these experiences, us beating ourselves up for not remembering all the details, or, those who have disclosed and have had to work with law enforcement and then are somewhat forced to remember things or try to remember things, and then feeling bad about not being able to remember. Mm-hmm. And I remember beating myself up, fairly recently in the last, 10 years of trying to kind of put the pieces together or like, this didn't really happen, or this wasn't really sexual violence, or I wasn't really harmed, or we were just playing. And then I, really think back and put the pieces together, and it's like, actually, no, like that was not really play. And this incident happened one time where I was told that if I did tell somebody, they were going to kill my sister. Like that was the threat. And I remember thinking it was like a joke, but then also feeling like it was funny. Like, I don't know. That's the part that's the really foggy to me, is like how I reacted to all of that. Like I have no memory of how I reacted.
Yeah.
And I feel like it was just not admitting like what happened, just sure. Like completely denying sure. it. But then it was impossible for me to completely deny it. And this is where I think the most harm came in, was not so much the assault and what happened to me. Like that was hard. And it's funny, like I still have, for the longest time up until a year ago, I had an olfactory memory that would come up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now I got lost what I was talking about. Just the memory came up.
That's okay. That's okay. But you were talking about what your feelings were in terms of the threat of your sister being killed, but your lack of memory is of what your response was.
Yeah, the lack of memory. And I remember them like threatening my sister, and I remember being scared about that. And I also remember, this is the part that caused, I feel like, the most harm, or that hurt me the most, was it was the next day or a couple of days later. Maybe it happened on a weekend, but whatever. The very next time that we were at school, older girls from the class, because I was in 4th grade and these students were all in 5th grade higher, coming to me at school and telling me that I had had sex, and were teasing me and making fun of me and calling me a little slut and saying this stuff. And I remember, like, right now I'm saying this and I'm feeling the feeling right now, the embarrassment and the shame. I'm feeling it right now, you know? And it was that. And I very vividly remember, you can't ever tell anybody about this. You can't say anything. And not only did I hold in that secret, but it was all of me. That day of knowing that, like, other people can tell something about me without me even saying anything. And granted, they had information from the person that harmed me, but still, it was that whole thing, realizing that as a little person, I completely shut down. I closed myself off. Like, that was it. I was done.
Right.
That moment. And I did not speak up and tell anybody about what happened to me until I was in my 40s.
Right. That is so typical and falls right in line with the neuroscience of trauma. Part of what I'm trying to educate people on, and why I really appreciate when my guests do what you're doing, and that is telling those emotional impacts that change your life. From that day on, your life changed. And that amount of shame, we just did an episode a couple of weeks ago on shame and how isolating it is.
Yeah.
And we talked about how the isolation stems from what you just said, not wanting anybody to know what happened, not only the physical act, but the emotional response that you had, which was horror and fear. I'm guessing you said you were afraid.
Yeah, I've done something wrong, and doing something wrong and being wrong, or being something wrong, or being someone wrong has been a fear my entire life. And while you were just explaining that, reflecting that back to me, the other thing that I needed to also understand is, while I'm going through that part of hiding myself and being secretive about the sexual trauma that my body experienced, I'm also realizing my identity as a young queer person too. And realizing, and even before that incident had happened, that I was different, that I had attractions to my friends who were girls. I had a big crush on one of my teachers. Oh my gosh, I was obsessed with her.
Yes.
So I also knew that too. And there's also part of me that, when I'm growing up, I always felt like I was different. I looked different. I acted different. I was not like the other girls in my class. I wasn't about all the makeup and the girl stuff. Like, that just wasn't me. I was army and jeans and camouflage and all of that. And that doesn't mean anything about my sexual orientation. I just knew that I was not like other people. And that was also something that I didn't feel like I could be open about, or, I was as myself as I could be. I wanted to wear what I wanted to wear, and I was willing to fight my mom. I had long hair, and she always wanted to brush my hair. My grandma worked at Mervyn's and always bought us really nice clothes. I wouldn't say we were very low income, but we didn't have, my parents barely made it. I have memories of powdered milk when times were really rough, so my parents received help from my grandparents. And one of the ways my grandma helped was to provide us with clothing. Mm-hmm. And, I was a beautiful little girl in her eyes. Yeah. And so that's how she wanted to dress me. And I hated it. And I just remember having these fights with my mom about it, and having to brush my hair and all of those things. So I was also coming to terms with that part of myself too. And also, I'm older now, but my hesitancy or even resistance in coming out and talking about this is because people sometimes make that equation, or there's that myth that, oh, because you were sexually assaulted or sexually abused, that made you gay. And like, that is not true. That is a myth. I mean, I know that studies have been done. I'm not a scientist. I know for me that that's not true, that I was already having those kinds of things come to my mind. And I was already having those thoughts of being different and realizing my, attractions even before I was sexually assaulted as a child. But there's a fear of LGBTQ people sometimes speaking out about their childhood sexual abuse because of that right there. The idea that people are automatically just going to think, oh, because this happened to you, that means that you're gay. And that's not true.
So glad you brought that up. I want to emphasize that to audience members who have that misconception, who carry that myth and push it forward. The other thing that I want to address in terms of that isolation after the assault, but probably even before, and the way you were treated, was the social impact. Back then, nobody talked about being queer or gay, and it must have been, again, part of the isolation aspect of who you were.
This is the late 80s. And so, the tail end of the AIDS crisis, and you think about what was in the media at the time, that's all it was negativity towards gay people and gay men. And the media was not reflecting LGBTQ people in a fair light at all. No. The movies that were coming out at the time were doom and gloom, and queer characters were just being killed, and we always had these miserable lives. And for the most part, there's still a vein of that in current pop culture media right now. But you're right. And there weren't a lot of very positive representations. And, I had some fairly positive role models, but I never got it's okay for you to be who you are. And I didn't feel that. I always felt this pressure to fit into this little box of being what a little girl's supposed to be. And I didn't fit into that mold. I still don't fit into that mold. I identify as a woman, I'm cisgender, whatever, but I definitely didn't fit into that little box that people were trying to put me into when I was a little girl.
Yeah. I guess what I'm also wanting to emphasize is that in that pushback that you were receiving societally and from your family, the sense of isolation probably already felt familiar to you, so that when the sexual assault occurred, it was an easy place to go, to isolate yourself even more and to keep more of this quiet. Am I right in that presumption?
I've always been like, I don't know, there's a part of me that is incredibly gregarious and friendly and outgoing. And I've always been that part of me. Like, there's a little girl in me that gets really excited about being around other people. I remember my parents' friends would be coming across the street and I'd get so excited. I'd like bang on the window. One time I banged on the window so hard I broke it because I was just so excited that people were coming over. I remember that shifting a lot after the incident. Also, on the other side of being very gregarious and outgoing, I'm also very introspective, and there's a reclusive part to me too, and a quiet part to me. And so those two things were kind of at odds, but that part of me, I definitely did allow, I feel, to kind of take over. And I just got really angry. I was so angry. I remember in middle school, 5th grade and middle school. And in front of my parents, I have like another artifact here to share with you, but my parents were moving. I sometimes think about like, what if I had said something? Had I told my parents, had I told somebody, what would have happened? And my parents were moving and they had this box of my things. And I found what was like it said my book. And it was literally, this was like a school assignment. And there's a picture of me in 4th grade, little Heather. One of the entries in here, I'm going to read to you, because when I read this, my heart sank. This is where I was able to pull a string from my anger to a point where that came from, or could have come from, or where this was coming from. So the journal entry was supposed to be when I'm afraid. And this is what I wrote. There are some things I am afraid of. Kidnappers, because they chase you. I'm also afraid of my friend because he plays with knives. One more thing, I'm afraid of my friend's dog because it bit me. These are the things I'm afraid of. I had literally written in a school assignment that my friend was playing with a knife and I was afraid of him. This went to a teacher. This went across the teacher's desk. I don't know if my parents even read this, but when I read that, I was like, I said something. I disclosed. Like, I was trying in fourth grade to tell somebody that I was afraid, and nothing happened. I had a lot of anger. This was before the Child Advocacy Center model.
Mm-hmm.
This was before trauma-informed care. This was before they were really doing any support for kids that were experiencing this kind of abuse. So had I disclosed and said something, I probably would have been more traumatized. I probably would have been more harmed. I might be dead right now because of that experience. The universe or whatever was telling me, you cannot say anything to anybody about it. It's easy for me to look back with my knowledge now, having been working in victim services for 5 years, to look back with that mindset and be like, oh, I could have done this and X, Y, and Z would have happened. But I have no way of knowing that. Right. And it wouldn't have happened because it was a completely different time. So I was the manager of the Rape Crisis Center in Napa County for 3 of the 5 years that I worked for our local nonprofit, Sexual Assault Victim Services. And I thought that I didn't even really think about what had happened to me, that it was even going to like affect me in my work. Because it was like, I just felt like I was just so okay. I went to therapy, like I've at somewhat of a peace with it. I had talked to like someone through another program who's a therapist, and, like, are you sure you want to do that? I was like, yeah. Yes, this is what I want to do this. I want to do this. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't totally healed. And the pandemic is what really screwed me up. It was the isolation. You keep talking about the isolation of the pandemic. Doing this work during the in isolation was really, really, really hard for me. And I don't even want to say like triggering, because I don't even know what it really was that screwed me up so much. But doing this work during the pandemic, it started to really affect me. I started to the flashbacks were coming back, the memories were coming back. I was really getting to the point, and I wasn't even doing a lot of direct client services. Like, I had a whole team of people that were doing that stuff, but just being around it in the office, or not even around in the office, like not even having any, like during the pandemic, being isolated, not really just having the space to explore this and talk about it and be supportive in that way. Like, I was talking to my partner, but I can't get all of my support from my partner, my wife. That's just not fair to her. Yeah. That makes it just a not fun relationship for anybody.
Exactly.
It was that. And I got to the point where it was like, I am so not okay. I can't hear another breakdown of a case. I can't observe another trial. I can't hear another MDI. I can't be in another meeting talking about the cases, because it just felt so close and so real. And I wasn't really being honest and telling people how it was affecting me. I was just trying to push through, but I was so dysregulated and so triggered in my body that I was saying things and doing the complete opposite in my actions and my behavior. Yeah. And I'm not surprised that it ended the way that it ended. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and the work definitely changed my life in the fact that it got me to a place where I was like, okay, you need to tell your parents what happened to you. And that's what happened last year. It was like the voice that told me that I needed to take a break, a mental health break. And that turned into 12 weeks of intense therapy again, and EMDR. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that stuff at some point too, but yes. Really just leaning in and doing the work, because I hadn't truly done it to the way that I needed to do it. Like, I hadn't given myself that space. And I'm a person who has the privilege to, I could take the time off to work on myself.
I'm going to ask about that emotional aspect that you went through, and not only the emotional, but the cognitive realization that, wow, this is actually activating so much in me in terms of my memories and past, that maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Was that kind of a cognitive realization, or were you just so uncomfortable with the feelings that you were like, I need out of this?
It was a little bit of both. I heard very clearly, and I remember the day that it happened. I was on my rowing machine, and it was like the voice of my higher power. You need to take a break. You can't go to work anymore. It was like that voice of you can't do this anymore. You can't go to work anymore. And so I started crying. I got off my rowing machine and I called my coworker, and I was like, hey, the voice is telling me I need to not go to work. I need to take a break. I need to take a mental health break. What do you think about that? And she was like, duh. And was very supportive. and, all of the things. But yeah, it was a very clear, you cannot do this anymore.
Did you feel or have the impression emotionally or cognitively that you were doing not only self-harm in terms of that activation of those old feelings that you were feeling in your body and in your memories emotionally, but do you feel like you did harm to anyone else as a result of that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can't say that I was like intentionally or cognizant of like doing harm or that it was malicious, but did I harm people through not being honest with myself, not being honest with other people, not taking the time? Yeah, I think that there was probably some harm to the people that I worked with. I don't think directly to any people that were coming and receiving services because I didn't have direct contact like that.
Right.
But yeah, I was being triggered. I was dysregulated. I was crying.
Oh, wow.
Really emotional, really, the thing that was really telling for me was my reaction. When I get incredibly reactionary, when I'm not even thinking, I'm just reacting and I'm just doing things, and that's what I was reacting to every little thing. And not only was I actually physically reacting, like my body. And I only learned this after I left and removed myself from some people that I was working around and just, not being in the office and whatnot. I was reacting like my body was without me even knowing it. And that's like the complex PTSD. And that's all that stuff that, I'm sure your listeners have heard a lot of, but that's where that comes in. And so I was cognizant, but not cognizant. It's like I was aware, but I was so wrapped up in myself. I was so wrapped up in what was going on with me that I wasn't really paying attention to how it was affecting the people around me. And that has been a common pattern in my life with my self-harm and trying to deal with things by not being honest and open and living my authentic truth. Yeah.
And living your authentic truth right now, as I'm hearing you talk, seems to be a huge part of your life now. Is part of the healing journey, I'm sure. Your honesty and authenticity is what I want my audience to hear. It's the critical aspect of healing that I think every victim and survivor needs to go through in order to further their healing. So the fact that you're here and talking about it is absolutely amazing and truly, from the bottom of my heart, appreciated. I don't know if you had in your mind where you wanted to go next, but I'm going to go back to something you said about an olfactory response.
Yeah. So let's talk about that.
Are you willing to tell us about that?
Let's go there. Yeah, because the olfactory memory was a huge thing for me to overcome. Prior to the assault with the two older kids, one of the kids had kicked, it was like a mop bucket or some cleaning thing in the kitchen that smelled like pine. I don't think it was pine sol. It was probably some it's like a very distinct poor pine scent from the 80s. I hadn't smelt it in a while, but years ago, or when I, moved in with my partner, the Myers brand soap came out with a pine scent, and they're using the same combination of this real poor, cheap scent from the 80s that smelled just like it. So, example, I came home and I washed my hands and smelled it, and it was like this reaction. I know that I'm experiencing fear or I'm scared when I can't breathe. I think just related to being strangled and the knife and that whole thing. But it was very much like I was back in that moment in my body after smelling that scent. And I was like, okay, you can't buy this anymore. I can't smell the scent anymore. I need to eliminate the world of the scent, which is very impossible to do. So there'll be times where I would just be out in public and I would have the scent and it would immediately send me back. My body would just react. So I got a therapist a year ago, more than a year ago, when I started to realize that I maybe needed to talk to somebody about what I was feeling. And maybe I wasn't as healed as I thought I was working with my last therapist through my sexual trauma. I started working with this individual and they introduced EMDR, which I know that in some camps, EMDR is not useful for survivors. In other camps, EMDR has been great for survivors. I know that there's some therapists that won't even use that modality because it can only be evidence-based if you're following the actual script of EMDR, if you deviate from that. And I also say this, I'm not a therapist And I usually don't like to talk about the methods or tools that I've used because they're unique to me and my experience. And I don't want anybody to think that, oh, I can just do this like Bailie did and I'll get better. Like, that's not what I'm saying here at all. So I say all this with caution. But yeah, EMDR, it changed my life and working with this therapist. And so it was actually a week before my wedding. And I had told my therapist, I'm going to meet up with my family. I'm going to be triggered. There's going to be some drama. I'm getting married. And I just need to overcome this thing. Like, can we work through this? And she's like, that's usually not how therapy works. I'm like, well, this is doing therapy with Bailie and this is how I am. So we need to push this along, please. And I had actually not even realizing that I was traumatizing myself, but also trying to heal myself. Is even before the session I met with my therapist, I put some of that stuff on a piece of paper towel. And I sat in my office and I smelled it. I wrote down everything. I wrote down what came up. When I started intentionally thinking about the smell and the memory of what happened during that incident, the pieces started to fall together. More of my memory started to fall together. And I started to remember, I remember watching the dust. And I remember wincing in pain, being stabbed, and those kinds of things. So much that since then, in the last year, there have been some moments where I've had impressions where I'll have a feeling in an area where I was harmed. And it's like, I just feel it. Even though nothing is going on, I could feel what had happened to me when I was 9 years old, my body. And so when those things happen, I will talk to my therapist or I'll utilize the kind of tools that she gave me. But EMDR was amazing. We went back, we kind of did the same practice. I had the scent. She asked me the question. And it was through that I actually have gotten to a point now where I can smell that scent. I don't like it. I don't want it around. I don't want my wife to purchase it, even though she loves that scent. But I can smell it and not have the reaction now. My body will not go into reaction mode and I won't be triggered kind of internally, like with intrusive thoughts or anything like that's changed with the process of kind of unpacking it and rewiring my brain to have positive associations, not even positive associations like with the scent or with the memory, but just getting back to the semblance of I'm okay now. I'm not in that moment. It's not happening to me now. So I've kind of learned these various tools. It's actually been less than a year.
Yeah.
I left at the end of November that I've been on this journey of just kind of learning about my body and learning about complex trauma and learning with my therapist of just how this stuff really works with your brain and all of that stuff, which I know your viewers are very versed in because they've probably heard many professionals on here talking about those things. And I'm not, so I'm just going to not go there. Prior to this work I did this past year with this therapist in EMDR, put myself through therapy and was all like, okay, I understand this. And it was like, I kind of understood things more on like an intellectual way. Like, oh, if I understand it intellectually, then I know things and whatever. So it was completely different. But also I had grown up not really understanding the value of therapy, the value of self-care, the value of talking about these things, the value of exploring and changing and growing from your bad experiences or whatnot. And so what I've experienced this year and the EMDR, especially in overcoming this olfactory memory, was really that this stuff kind of can work. And it was made me more of a believer. As much as I'd been preaching in my work and connecting people with therapy and this and that, I was also going through, and that was the thing that made this complicated in the work, was while I was working with the staff and intellectually understanding how to serve survivors and how to help survivors and all those things, people are afraid to talk about it because of the stigma, because they don't want to be judged, because of the fear of rejection, all those things. Here I am, an employee of an agency supposed to do those things, and hear myself, I'm going through those exact things. You know, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to tell my parents this thing in a month and they're not going to believe me. It's all this same stuff. So it was really, really hard to disconnect from like my world, the world of the people in my office, the world of the people that we were serving. It just was a mess. And I was partly responsible for a lot of that because of just not being in tune with myself and not being honest. And again, falling back on my old survival mechanisms of perfectionism, overachieving, and not letting anybody know or see what is really going on with me. And I became a master at those three things throughout my life.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This was part one of a two-part series featuring Bailie. Be sure to tune in next week for the conclusion of our conversation. I want to thank Bailie for agreeing to be a guest on my show and for her bravery, courage, and strength in telling a part of her story of sexual assault and rape, and for her honesty and authenticity in telling of her thoughts and attempts of suicide and her decisions to live. We're grateful for your life, Bailie. Don't forget to tune in next week to hear part 2 of Bailie's amazing story. It is intriguing and powerful, and you won't want to miss it. Until then, please do all you can to help promote suicide prevention awareness by sharing resources that help others recognize the warning signs for suicide and know how to get help. And please do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. A good way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.